In this video, let's explore what the moon means in the third house, and let's take a look at what it actually looks like in 3 real birth charts. We'll use Boy George, Will Ferrell, and George W. Bush. In order to equip ourselves with the intelligent ammunition that we need to understand the moon in the third house, let's take a moment to first review what the third house symbolizes and what the moon symbolizes. Here you see what the third house physically is. It's the area of sky that's on the eastern side of the underground quadrant. That's why the third house represents whatever it represents. The underground quadrant represents the interior of our being, and the east represents sunrise and visualization and tangibility. So the third house, being on the eastern section of the underground sky, represents the expression of what's inside of us. Expressing the internal will have both an effect on your external and your internal. The third house is the house of strength. Strength is the expression of your power. Power is an internal thing. Expression of power also means that the third house represents skill, and expression of your power gets you into conflict with other things that are expressing their power. So the third house represents conflict, or the use of power, the use of force. And so it has to do also with the people with whom we contend, our siblings and our equals, our peers. On the internal side, the internal dimension of strength is confidence, decision making, and discipline, sticking by decisions. Also, internal power and strength means ambition. So the third house has to do with our lusts, our drives, our motivations, our hunger. And the third house, therefore, is about what we want. It's a self-focused house. And so it's a house of independence, individuality. Now, we understand what the third house is all about. Let's take a look at the moon. The moon is a complicated planet, because if you think about the moon, the obvious things about it is that it comes out at night, not like the sun, but like the sun, it's very bright. So it has this complicated nature of being bright, but night. And that's the third thing about the moon, is that you can't really tell what it is. It keeps changing. The shape of it always changes and everything. So it's a night, bright, and a changing planet. Changing planet, this is why the moon represents flux and fluctuation. This is why it has to do with cycles, rhythm, timing, and fluids. The brightness of the moon, that's why the moon represents beauty, things that catch your eye, things that attract your eye. The nightiness of the moon, this is why it has to do with things that are unseen. So the moon represents private things. Things that people are shy about, that they don't really want to show. Things that are personal, that you keep to yourself. Or things that happen within your private space, so domestic things. The moon is therefore feminine, because femininity is an inward power. It moves inward, it moves in. Unseen means inward, internal. And so the moon also represents the internal aspect of anyone. So the mind instead of the body. The mind is the tool by which we experience emotion. It's not intellect by which we figure things out. The moon represents the mind, the thing that experiences emotions. So the moon represents emotions. Emotions are based on some permutation of happiness or sadness in past, present, or future. So happiness and sadness results from fulfilling or not fulfilling your desires. So the moon is the planet of desires. And desires are based on opinions. What you want and what you don't want is based on what you think is good and what you think is not good. So the moon is the planet of opinion, subjectivity, bias. Finally, the moon is a lot like the sun in terms of how bright it is. So like the sun, it's also an authority figure, and it represents authorities. But because it's an internal feminine planet, it represents the feminine archetype of authority, whereas the sun represented the masculine archetype of authority, and therefore the father. The moon, being the feminine archetype of authority, is therefore the mother. Now we understand the players, the moon and the third house. Let's put them together. The moon in the third house. What kind of interpretation do we come up with? Well, first of all, the moon is female, but the third house is masculine. The third house is about externalizing the internal thing. So if anything, it's about the conversion of femininity into masculinity. Because masculine means external comes out and feminine means internal goes in. So it's a clash between the moon being female and the third house being male. The interpretation is sabratri. That means that you're close with your competitors or close with your peers. Or it also means you're assisted by your peers or your siblings and so forth. So it's a complex situation with how one competes. When the moon is in the third house, one isn't too competitive and aggressive. Rather, they tend to get what we would call coddled by their peers. The peers will kind of like them and not treat them so much as a threat. And hence, they kind of have this sort of entitlement. The moon in the third house is sort of an entitled interpretation. They get spoon-fed or they get coddled by the people that you would think would be aggressive towards them or competitive with them. And the reason why is because they're kripana, which here basically means it evokes your kripa, which means it evokes your sympathy. The moon in the third house tends to evoke sympathy. And we can say it means you're pathetic because the word pathetic means evoke sympathy. So people with the moon in the third house, they tend to be people that we can sort of feel for. We can sympathize with. They don't seem that aggressive. So therefore, we don't take that much of a competitive stance towards them. Secondly, the moon is very private, but the whole nature of the third house is to externalize and express the private thing. So it's sort of a clash, and the result is what's described as bala shaurya, which means they have strong bravery, or they're strong on the inside. They're internally strong. And this again is just another permutation of the female-male dichotomy between moon and third house. Internally female, strong male. What happens if you're internally strong, or if you have strength or bravery on the inside? It means that you are not scared to express. You like to express. You like to show or say. You don't hold things back. The third thing about the moon in the third house is that the moon is the planet of desire and the third is the house of ambition. So this is a nice thing. They're on the same page finally, exactly on the same page. And so we describe this as pramada, which basically means a lot of desires. They're desirous, or you could say wanton, lustful. And again, this word shaurya also pertains here because shaurya also means ambitious. Now, our theory about this moon in the third house is pretty clear, but let's take it out of the theory stage and come and see it in actual practice in some charts of well-known people. So we have Boy George, Will Ferrell, George Bush. Let's examine these three interpretations and how it relates to them. Is Boy George entitled and coddled and pathetic or sympathetic? Maybe not, but if you look at the raw source of this interpretation, it's very shocking. Boy George, the moon in the third house is the female-male dichotomy working together. That's Boy George. Will Ferrell is obviously not Boy George, but Will Ferrell is very entitled and coddled. He says of himself that he's an Orange County suburban child with no danger or drama ever in his life. And so the reason that he turned to comedy was just to break up the boredom. George W. Bush, super entitled, super coddled, just handed things by his dad, basically. On the second thing of being expressive, right? Boy George, again, very, very clear illustration of this principle of the moon in the third house, making somebody that's very expressive. Will Ferrell, yeah, very expressive. Look at the face that he's doing. George Bush, maybe, I'm not so sure. It doesn't really seem like it's a strong match there. And this third thing about the moon in the third house is we expect these people to be very ambitious or lusty or wanton. Boy George, sure, that's obvious. Will Ferrell, I don't know, maybe? I don't know. And Bush, really not sexually, but maybe extremely so politically. So Boy George wants to know some more detail about his chart, and he wants to know, why am I such a fit for this first bit? Why am I such a gender bender? What is it about the moon in the third house that made me a gender bender that didn't make Will Ferrell or George W. a gender bender? Well, first thing I want you to look at is the planet in his first house. It's Venus. And what is his first house? It's Taurus. So here you have an example of the first lord in a female sign. And guess what? It's also in Pisces Navamsha, which means it's exalted Venus, and also it means it's in a female Navamsha. So here's an example of the first lord in a female sign and female Navamsha, as we were learning in Pathetically. Now we want to look at the moon and see if it's also in female sign and Navamsha. His moon, yes, it's in a female sign, Cancer, and its Navamsha is also Cancer. So here's the perfect example of that principle from Pathetically that we recently learned in our live streams. Here's a male person with a very strong female yoga. That's why his moon in the third house is really showing its colors in terms of female-male dichotomy. Furthermore, his moon in the third house is with Mercury, who's a transgender planet. But Boy George has another question. He says, I think I'm a lot more artistic and expressive than these other two guys, especially George W. Bush. So why is it that I'm so artistic and expressive? Bush also has moon in the third house and he's not. So for this, you just see what we just described about gender bender, because it's basically the same thing. Because female is internal, male is external. If you're bending or blurring the line between male and female, then you're allowing the internal to get expressed. Then you're artistic and expressive. So besides that, you just have an exalted Navamsha domicile Rashi Venus in the first house. And you don't expect to be artistic? Of course, right? Besides that, I always explain that an artistic person will have very prominent connections between houses 3, 5, and 11. His moon in the third house is his third lord. And that transgendered Mercury that's right next to it is the fifth lord. So have you connected the third and the fifth house? Certainly. You put the third lord and the fifth lord together in the third house. And what about the 11th lord? That would be Jupiter. And where is it? It's in the 10th house. Very dominant. Now, Will Ferrell pushes George aside and he says, George is very sexy, but I'm not. How come I'm not? First thing is, look at our 8th house. Mr. Ferrell has a debilitated Saturn there, and that Saturn is his fifth lord. Fifth lord is also pretty important in terms of sexuality, sexiness, and sex drive. Second thing is, go ahead and look at the moon itself, because the interpretation of the moon is it could make you very wanton. But Will Ferrell's moon is debilitated in the third house, and even more importantly, it's with Ketu, who's asexual. Finally, take a look at Ferrell's first house. It also has Venus in it, but it's debilitated Venus. Now, George W. Bush comes late to the party, and he says, hey, I'm not sexy, but I am artistic, and I was the president. So how come I am artistic like these other fellas, and these other guys, they didn't become president of the United States. So how come? So for artistic, again, let's take a look at 3, 5, and 11 and see if those houses are combining or not, or what's going on with those houses. Well, right next to his moon in the 3rd house is Jupiter. Jupiter is the 5th lord. So the 5th lord is in the 3rd house. And what sign is it in? Libra. Venus' sign, an artistic sign. So that covers the 3rd and the 5th, especially the 5th. What about the other two, 3rd house and 11th house? The 3rd lord is Venus and the 11th lord is Mercury. Take a look at the 1st house. The 3rd and the 11th lord have combined in the 1st house. So, yeah, George W. Bush is not exactly Picasso, but pretty damn good. Way better than I would have expected as a painter. And also, this little K2 that's sitting there in his 5th house has something to tell us as well. It says, psst, I'm a Raj Yoga. I'm a secret little Raj Yoga. You probably didn't notice. Because I'm getting a super strong aspect from Mars, and Mars is the Yogacara. And if a node gets a strong aspect from a Yogacara, while that node is in a Kendra or a Kona, then that constitutes a Raj Yoga. So the Raj Yoga in the 5th house also increases artistic capacity. Okay, that explains why this guy's unexpectedly somewhat artistic. But how about why he became the president of the United States? Usually when we see people who have a great deal of political power or social influence, we find a lot of Raj Yogas. We do find that one Raj Yoga in his 5th house, but Bush's chart is not riding on Raj Yogas. It's riding on a Parvata Yoga. And this is not any run-of-the-mill Parvata Yoga. This is a very, very, very clear, strong Parvata Yoga. I would call it a double ultra Parvata Yoga. So definition of Parvata Yoga basically is if you have a benefic in the central houses, 1, 4, 7, and 10, without malefics being in sight. Like typically, if you can't have malefics aspecting the ascendant, so especially if you don't have malefics across from the ascendant in 6, 7, and 8, but you do have benefics in the Kendra, then you qualify for this thing called Parvata Yoga. Parvata means like a mountain, so it means, superior, having a high position. In Bush's case, he has 2 benefics, and they're not just in the Kendra, they are in the 1st house, and he has malefics nowhere able to look at them at all. There's no malefics in the Kendras, there's no malefics in 6, 7, and 8. The malefics are completely out of the way in 2 and 12. His outstanding social status, ability to become president of the United States, is riding on this Parvata Yoga, plus the entitlement factor granted by the moon being with Jupiter in the 3rd house. If you want to actually have my interpretations for all of your placements in your chart, you can go to my website and order that from the charts page. It's victorcara.com/R2. Thank you so much.